everybody. Welcome to the first ever episode of my first ever podcast, Tabletop Tutoring. I'm hoping that this will be a space where new players and inexperienced players for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons can come and get a bit of a handle on the rules. It's going to be my aim to explain and explore some of the rules and concepts within D&D, as well as provide a space where some more experienced players can get a bit of a different insight on the game. I'll go into it a bit from now. This episode is just going to be an introduction to the podcast. For now though, let's get into essentially episode 0 of Tabletop Tutoring. So I'd like to just start by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Ben. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for about 10 years, and I am also a Dungeon Master. I started playing in 4th edition, which didn't go too well, unfortunately. For whatever reason, I just didn't have a lot of friends who played the game, so I had a lot of difficulty actually finding a game. And also, I never really had much of a chance to get a hold on the rules. I played one Pathfinder campaign, which was fun. I played that with some friends that I made at a food charity I was working at. After that, when I got my first job, I made a friend who also really liked Dungeons & Dragons and was in a game, and he asked his DM if there was room for one more, and fortunately there was. And I played in that game for a good long while and had a lot of fun. A lot of stories were told and a lot of memories made. Unfortunately, however, due to commitments with the DM, that game just ended really abruptly in like the middle of the campaign. My first time running a game of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition went terribly. I had no idea what I was doing. I was not familiar with the rules at all. And I wasn't familiar with the story that I was running. So I just had no idea what I was doing. It lasted 2 sessions, and although my players seemed to enjoy themselves, it was just putting a lot of stress on me, especially not knowing what I was doing. So I gave that up. But now I am regularly playing Dungeons & Dragons once a week, and I'm also the Dungeon Master for 2 different sets of people for whom I'm running the same story. Now, if you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons or tabletop role-playing games at all, have no fear, because now I'm going to tell you what they are. So basically, a tabletop role-playing game, or TTRPG, or RPG, is a game where a bunch of people sit around a table. And at this table, there will be 2 or more players and 1 dungeon master. The players act out the roles of characters that they create using character sheets. The character sheet has statistics and some worded descriptions as well of the character that they're playing, and the player's job is to essentially act out this role, is to role play as their character. The dungeon master, on the other hand, they act out the roles of all the people, animals, and other creatures that the player characters interact with. The Dungeon Master also narrates the world that the player's characters are experiencing. The Dungeon Master is every village that the characters step foot in. They're every farmer that they save from the bandits. They are the bandits themselves. The Dungeon Master is the dragon, is the forces of magic and of chaos and order in the world that the player characters are role-playing as. So, if you still don't quite understand it, I'm going to explain it this way. when you play a computer game, the person you control in the computer game is your character, and you are the player. The computer, the game, the world that the game is in, all the characters that your character speaks to, all the enemies that your character kills or comes across or whatever, they are all the dungeon master. So the dungeon master's job is huge because they are literally everything and they have to know everything about everything within the game. Um, and the player's job is just a lot of fun. I love playing Dungeons and Dragons. I love dungeon mastering as well. I couldn't tell you which I liked more. But yeah, that's basically a tabletop role playing game, and there are many different kinds of role playing games. Dungeons and Dragons, as the name suggests, is very swords and sorcery and intrepid adventures going on a long, long quest to find magic items and to save the land. But there are also games like Call of Cthulhu, which is a tabletop role playing game based on the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. It is a horror themed game, and much like H.P. Lovecraft's writings, is based around insanity and experiencing the otherworldly to a point where it drives the player's characters a little bit mad. It is a very difficult game to play, so I've heard. I've never actually had the chance to play it, even though I have the books. um, but yes, it's a very difficult game to stay alive and well in. There's another tabletop role-playing game called Seventh Sea, which is pirates and swashbuckling and romance and adventure. And there's Vampire the Masquerade, which is vampires engaging in politics and backstabbing and trying to constantly one-up each other. So, whatever you like for your gaming experience, chances are there's probably an RPG out there that will account for it. I hope to talk about these games in the future. At this point, I'm only going to be talking about the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons because it's the one I'm most familiar with. I own the books for other games and I've read through the rules and I feel I understand them properly, but I'm really not willing to talk about anything, or at least I'm not willing to instruct anyone in anything that I haven't personally played or experienced yet. So keep an eye on this space for other RPGs, but for the moment, it's just going to be Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And I feel like that's a good place to start because D&D is one of the oldest and most well-known, well-loved role-playing games out there. It is currently the most popular system of gaming for tabletop role-playing. It is famous. It's had movies, it's had TV series, animations. There are several really, really good content creators out there creating content based around 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, possibly most notably Critical Role, where a bunch of really awesome voice actors play Dungeons and Dragons. That's one of my all-time favorite shows. So yeah, I feel like D&D 5th edition is a really good place to start because it is so accessible, and the rules are really, really elegant in that they're simple to explain, easy to learn, difficult to master, really good entry-level RPG, I feel. So yeah, that's me, that's the podcast, and what I hope to achieve with it. A little bit about the history of D&D. So basically, D&D begins in the 60s. In 1967, the International Federation of Wargaming was founded by a gentleman called Gary Gygax. Wargaming at the time was a game type where two people would come together, put a battle map down on the table, and they would set up miniature toy armies. And they would use dice rolls and rulers and a turn-based combat system in order to outmaneuver and win enemy territory or defeat the enemy army. A very popular war game that still very much exists today is Warhammer 40k. So in '67, in '67 Gary Gygax founds the International Federation for Wargaming, and in '68 he hosts the Lake Geneva War Games Convention, which is today known as Gen Con. In 1969, Gary Gygax meets a gentleman by the name of Dave Arneson at the second Gen Con, and the two discuss creating a new rule set for a different style of wargaming. As time progressed after this meeting, increased interest began to occur in the realm of medieval-themed war games. And in response to this, Gary Gygax founded the Castle and Crusade Society as a sub-organization of the IFW. Eventually, Gygax collaborated with a gentleman called Jeff Perrin on a game called Chainmail, which essentially served as the forerunner to D&D. In 1973, Gygax and Arneson collaborated on the initial drafts of Dungeons and Dragons, and Gygax formed a company called Tactical Studies Rules with a gentleman called Don Kay. Don Kay was a member of a wargaming club that Gygax was a member in, so that's how they met. Later on, a man called Brian Bloom also joined Tactical Studies Rules in order to help produce the game. Shortly after this, the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was published in January 1974, and the initial 1,000-print run was sold out by November. A second 1,000-print run was ordered, and that sold out in 6 months. After several successful years, TSR became TSR Hobbies Incorporated, and that company developed Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which was essentially the second edition. It contained more character creation options as well as content for the original game. But most notably, it was the first version of Dungeons & Dragons to introduce the core rulebooks that we still know and love today, called the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Now, TSR Hobbies Incorporated had many more successful years. In 1997, the company was purchased by Wizards of the Coast, and Wizards of the Coast then released Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition, which was the first edition of the game to use the dice system that we still use today. After that, they released 3.5, which added more character creation options and more content to 3rd Edition. In 2009, Wizards of the Coast released Dungeons & Dragons 4th Edition, and unfortunately that didn't go down too well. The game had just been slowed right down, and there were hundreds and hundreds of tedious calculations needed to do a single thing during combat. That and the character options were just really, really restrictive. There really wasn't much in the way of customization for your characters or anything really much that differentiated how different characters felt or anything. There were a bunch of other reasons that's basically it. So after getting panned by the community for 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast released a program called D&D Next. And what that was Wizards of the Coast putting out drafts of content for the next iteration of D&D and having community playtesters, over 100,000 playtesters from the D&D community, collaborate on this content. And they would play through it, they would give Wizards of the Coast feedback, Wizards of the Coast would listen to this feedback and they would change things and mechanics and they would tweak, hand it back to the playtesters, and the playtesters would say yay or nay, and this continued on and on and on until eventually in 2014 the fruits of D&D Next's labor was Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. As I said, that was released in 2014, and to date 5th edition D&D is the most popular system for tabletop role-playing game. It's really just a great system. It's streamlined, it's easy to learn quickly, and it's easy to get used to. It's easy to build off of and to adapt and to change rules, which I'm going to go into next episode, briefly. But yeah, it's just a really, really good game. I love it so much. I have a lot of passion for it. And I have a lot of passion for bringing people into the game. I love the way that this game works because it's not just like a board game where you have a fun moment. D&D is unique among gaming circles in that there's really nothing else like it. You don't just go to a place and do things with a board and markers. No. You go somewhere and you tell a story with your friends. Your dungeon master and the other players in your party. You travel these worlds together through your imagination and you create these memories and these stories and these characters, and you can get so emotionally involved and so attached to the characters you meet and the experiences you have in this game world. I can't tell you the amount of times I've bonded with friends over experiences that we shared in Dungeons and Dragons and in jokes that we've developed, and it's really something special, the fact that this game can affect you in a very emotional space if you let it. And it's why I love bringing people into the game so much, because you're not just playing a game together when you play Dungeons and Dragons, but you form a bond and you create memories. And at the end of a campaign, however short or long it may be, you have a story that you can reminisce with your friends. And you have a story that you've created. And I think that that's something really, really special. So, thank you so much for listening to me waffle on. I am hoping for this podcast to be a weekly thing, and next week I intend to release an episode about character creation. So if you're planning on tuning in next week, please do. If you're planning on tuning in next week, please try and download or print a copy of the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons character sheet, as I'm going to be referring to that a lot. So if you're interested in learning how to play Dungeons and Dragons, tune in next week, because that's when we're going to really start. And I hope you have a lovely day. I hope you're staying safe during this difficult time. And yeah, have a lovely day. Goodbye.